Imagine you could step back in time, not to some distant medieval past, but to a city that burned brighter than almost any other on Earth. We're talking about London during Britain's Golden Age, roughly from 1850 to 1900, a city that if you saw it for the first time would stop you dead in your tracks. Where do we even start? Let's begin with the streets. Wide boulevards lit by gas lamps, slowly converting to electric, lined with towering buildings that could rival anything in Paris or Vienna. By 1823, there were 40,000 gas street lamps across 215 miles of streets. By 1880, 1 million gas lamps consuming 6.5 million tons of coal annually. London became famous across Europe for the brightness of its streets at night, its shop fronts glowing like stages, its interiors warm with light when other cities still lived in darkness. Walk down the Strand in 1890, close your eyes, open them again, and you could swear you're in the heart of continental Europe. That wasn't an accident, it was a statement. London, during this period historians call the mid-Victorian era, or Britain's golden years, was experiencing prosperity unlike anything the world had seen. And the engine behind it all had a name: empire. Britain controlled territories across the globe, and wealth flowed into London like a river that never stopped. By the 1850s, national income per person had increased by half. London wasn't just rich, it was the capital of the richest, most powerful empire on the planet. And that wealth showed everywhere. You saw it in the architecture, in the grand hotels, in the theaters, in the restaurants, in the clothes people wore as they walked those electric-lit streets. The elite, the landowners, the industrialists, the bankers built mansions in neighborhoods like Mayfair and Belgravia that could compete with any aristocratic residence in Europe. But here's where it gets interesting. London wasn't just a city of the rich. It was a city of extremes, of contrasts so sharp they almost didn't seem real. How many people had flooded into London during these decades? The numbers are staggering. Between 1800 and 1900, London's population exploded from around 1 million to over 6 million. People came from Ireland, escaping famine. They came from Eastern Europe, fleeing persecution. At one point, Irish immigrants made up 20% of London's population. In 1853, the Irish population in London was estimated at 200,000, a number so large that if it were a city, it would have ranked as the third largest in England. The city became a place where you could hear half a dozen languages on a single street, where cultures crashed into each other in ways nobody had planned, but that created something entirely unique. The transportation revolution accelerated everything. Horse-drawn omnibuses first appeared in 1829. By 1854, there were 3,000 of them, painted in bright reds, greens and blues, each carrying an average of 300 passengers daily. The two-wheeled hansom cab, first seen in 1834, became the most common type on London's roads. By the end of the century, an estimated 10,000 cabs crowded the streets alongside coaches, private carriages, coal wagons, and tradesmen's vehicles. From the 1870s onward, Londoners also had access to a developing tram network connecting central London with expanding suburbs. That tension, that creative friction between the aristocratic West End and the desperate poverty of the East End, between European luxury and British grit, is exactly what made Victorian London so extraordinary. It wasn't just elegant, it was alive in every sense of the word. Picture this. While in the drawing rooms of Mayfair, a family of industrialists entertained ambassadors and European bankers with French champagne and string quartets. Just a few miles away, in the slums of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, newly arrived immigrants who didn't speak a word of English were crammed into filthy tenements with no running water, no sanitation, living 10 to a room. The contrast was brutal and unavoidable. But before we dive into that darkness, let's talk about the light. Let's talk about where London's elite went when the sun went down. Because the nightlife in Victorian London during the Golden Age wasn't just about rest. It was theatre, it was power, it was seduction, it was art, and it happened in very specific places. The first of those was, without question, the most magnificent. A building that still today, more than a century later, is considered one of the finest in the world. A theatre built to prove to the world that London had arrived. That building was the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden. And in the next chapter, we're stepping inside. All right, let's keep moving. We know the city. We understand the context. We can imagine those wide streets, those imposing buildings, that atmosphere of wealth and progress that defined Victorian London in the second half of the 19th century. Now it's time to enter one of its most iconic spaces, one that from the day it opened changed forever how this city saw itself. We're talking about the Royal Opera House. But before we describe it, think about something. Why does a city build an opera house? Not just any theatre, but one on a monumental scale, with materials brought from across Europe, with cutting-edge technology, with capacity for thousands. Why do that? The answer is more political than cultural, though the two are inseparable. London needed to prove something. It needed to tell the world, and especially Europe, that it wasn't just an industrial powerhouse or a military empire. It was civilization, it was refinement, it was culture, and the Royal Opera House was that declaration made stone and iron. Its story begins earlier. The first theatre on this site opened in 1732, but fire destroyed it in 1808. A second theatre opened in 1809, and fire destroyed that one too in 1856. The third and current Royal Opera House opened on May 15, 1858, designed by architect Edward Barry. And this time, they built it to last. The building is neoclassical, imposing, with a facade that announced its importance before you even stepped inside. But it's what happened inside that mattered. If you walked into the Royal Opera House in 1870, the first thing that would hit you was the scale. It's not big, it's massive. The main auditorium, shaped like a horseshoe, holds 2,256 people. But numbers don't capture it. What captures it is the feeling. The soaring ceiling, the tiers of boxes draped in crimson and gold, the crystal chandeliers hanging over the stalls, everything designed to make whoever entered feel they were in a place of exception. And the acoustics. The Royal Opera House became famous for its sound. Engineers and musicians agreed this was one of the finest acoustic spaces in Europe. A human voice without amplification of any kind could reach the furthest corner of the highest gallery with perfect clarity. That gallery, by the way, was where the less wealthy sat, because the Royal Opera House wasn't exclusive to the elite, or at least not completely. The layout of the hall reflected exactly the social hierarchy of the time. In the stalls and private boxes, many rented by prominent families year after year, sat the aristocracy, the industrialists, the diplomats. Up in the top galleries came the students, the immigrants with a bit of saved money, the workers who wanted to hear a famous tenor, even if it was from far away. That coexistence, though stratified, was part of the phenomenon. And what did people hear at the Royal Opera House during the Golden Age? Everything, practically everything the musical world considered extraordinary passed through Covent Garden. Legends like Maria Callas, Enrico Caruso, and Luciano Pavarotti would later perform there. In the Victorian era, the greatest voices and conductors of Europe made London a required stop. Why did they come? Money, partly. London could pay competitive contracts, but also because the Royal Opera House had earned a real reputation. Artists knew they'd perform before a demanding, informed audience that knew the repertoire and didn't forgive mediocrity. For a serious singer, that was genuine incentive. The official season began in spring and ran through autumn. It was the axis of cultural life for London's elite. Nights at the Opera House weren't just musical events. They were social events of the first order. People dressed for them with the same seriousness they'd prepare for a royal wedding. Men arrived in tailcoats or evening dress. women in long gowns, gloves, jewelry, and elaborate hairstyles that took hours. Arriving at the theatre was part of the show. Being seen was as important as hearing the opera. During intervals between acts, the theatre's foyer became a meeting room. Business deals were made there. Marriages were arranged. Politics was discussed. The Royal Opera House had salons designed specifically for that social function, spaces where people strolled, conversed, and maintained relationships that mattered more than anything happening on stage. If you're enjoying this journey through Victorian London's most luxurious nights, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because we're about to explore a side of the city the aristocrats never wanted you to see. But the Royal Opera House was just one face of Victorian London's night, and honestly, maybe not even the most interesting if you look with wider eyes. Because while the boxes glowed with their golden lamps, elsewhere in the city, something equally fascinating was happening, though far more democratic and far louder. If you want to see how the other half of London spent their nights, stick around, because what's coming next will surprise you. High culture at the Opera House was one thing, but Victorian London's nightlife went much deeper than velvet boxes and Italian tenors. It went into the streets, into the smoke-filled rooms, into spaces where working people, immigrants, sailors, and everyone in between came to forget their troubles for a few hours. We're talking about the music halls. And if there's one music hall that captures this world better than any other, it's Wilton's. Opened in 1858, the same year as the current Royal Opera House, Wilton's Music Hall was a completely different universe. John Wilton converted 5 terraced houses into this venue, and when it opened, it could pack in up to 1,500 people drinking, smoking, and enjoying the night's entertainment. The atmosphere was electric. Top acts would rush over from Covent Garden to perform on Wilton's stage. The famous Champagne Charlie, who literally drank from a champagne bottle while singing, appeared many times. The crowd loved it. This wasn't refined. This was raw, direct, visceral entertainment that didn't need costumes or pretense to exist. But Wilton's heyday was brief, just 22 years. By 1880, new fire regulations shut it down, and that was the pattern across London. Music halls exploded in the 1850s. By the 1870s, there were hundreds across Britain, but many disappeared just as quickly, victims of regulations, changing tastes, or simply burning down. Still, while they lasted, music halls were the heartbeat of working-class London. The programs were wild variety shows, singing, dancing, acrobatics, comedy sketches, performing animals, anything that could hold an audience's attention. The entry fee was cheap enough that even labourers could afford it. And unlike the Opera House, nobody cared how you dressed or whether you knew the difference between Mozart and a meat pie. But London's elite had their own spaces too, places that combined spectacle, luxury, and that particularly Victorian blend of propriety and indulgence. Let's talk about the pleasure gardens. Vauxhall and Ranelagh were the most famous. Open during summer evenings, these gardens offered music, dancing, food, drink, and the chance to mingle under the stars with London's fashionable crowd. If you could afford the entry fee, you were in. For much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, pleasure gardens were the height of culture and glamour. But by the Victorian era, their reputation had shifted. Many went down market, earning reputations for drunkenness and worse. By the late 1800s, they'd all disappeared, replaced by other forms of entertainment. The coexistence of these worlds, the opera house and the music hall, the pleasure garden and the filthy pub, wasn't a contradiction Victorian London tried to resolve. It was part of its identity. A city capable of containing both without either cancelling the other. And then there were the hotels. Because if the Royal Opera House was the temple of culture and the music halls were the people's theatre, the grand hotels were the stage where economic power displayed itself without any pretense. These were places designed to impress from the first second. The best example, though it opened in 1889, right at the tail end of our period, is the Savoy. Built by Richard D'Oyly Carte, the theatrical impresario behind Gilbert and Sullivan's operas, the Savoy was Britain's first true luxury hotel. And it changed everything. What made the Savoy revolutionary? It was the first hotel in Britain with electric lights throughout the entire building. Electric lifts, hot and cold running water in most of the lavishly furnished rooms, bathrooms en suite, a luxury almost unheard of at the time. Carte hired César Ritz as manager and Auguste Escoffier as chef de cuisine. Together, they established a standard of quality in hotel service and dining that attracted royalty, the wealthy and the powerful from across the world. The Savoy became the place where deals were made, where celebrities stayed, where Winston Churchill would later take his cabinet for lunch. But before the Savoy, other establishments filled that role. Claridge's, which traces its origins to 1812, was listed in the first edition of Baedeker's 1878 London Guide as the first hotel in London. And B, when Empress Eugénie visited in 1860 and entertained Queen Victoria there, the hotel's reputation was sealed. Brown's Hotel, opened in 1837, became the refuge of Victorian writers. Oscar Wilde, Robert Louis Stevenson, Bram Stoker, Arthur Conan Doyle, all stayed there. It's also where Alexander Graham Bell made the UK's first telephone call. These weren't just places to sleep, they were institutions. Dining in one of these hotels was a performance. The way you ordered, how you treated the sommelier, how you selected wine, how you handled the silverware, all of it communicated your level of education and refinement. Meals lasted 3 or 4 hours, with multiple courses and conversations that jumped from art to politics to imperial business. That was the standard format of elite sociability. The menus were deliberately French because France set the standard for sophistication. But London's hotels weren't content to just copy Europe. They wanted to equal it and eventually surpass it. And for wealthy men, there was another world entirely, one women couldn't enter: the gentlemen's clubs, White's, Brooks, the Cocoa Tree, Almack's. These were called golden halls, in contrast to the copper hells frequented by the lower classes. The epicenter of British gambling had migrated from Bath to London in the late 18th century, and by the Victorian era, these exclusive clubs had become institutions of power. Between 1600 and 1880, London developed into a global centre for commerce, its population swelling to around 5 million. The availability of luxuries increased dramatically during this boom, as did an economy driven by speculation. Businesses ran on borrowed capital, popularizing the idea of speculation as profit. No wonder a society addicted to luxury and speculation also institutionalized and glamorized gambling. These clubs were exclusively male spaces where the elite gambled, drank, and discussed politics in opulent rooms draped in velvet and lit by crystal chandeliers. Fortunes were won and lost in a single night. Financial speculation wasn't just business, it was a lifestyle, a religion almost. And the networking that happened in these clubs shaped the British Empire's direction as much as anything discussed in Parliament. The gambling culture was so intense that some members literally lost their family estates over a hand of cards. Stories circulated of men walking into White's worth thousands of pounds and leaving penniless before dawn. But Victorian morality was flexible when it came to wealthy men's vices. What happened in the clubs stayed in the clubs. The hypocrisy was staggering when you consider this was also a century of huge charity and social progress in other areas. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because we can't talk about Victorian London's golden age without acknowledging the other side. The side that didn't glitter. While the West End sparkled with gas lamps and champagne, the East End drowned in filth and desperation. The author George Reynolds wrote in 1844 about the brutal wealth disparities. The most unbounded wealth is the neighbour of the most hideous poverty. He wasn't exaggerating. London's slums were nightmares, entire families crammed into single rooms, no sanitation. No clean water. The Thames River was thick with human sewage. Streets were covered with horse dung. Diseases spread like wildfire. In Liverpool in 1851, only 45% of babies born survived to age 20. London's numbers weren't much better. Overcrowding, malnutrition, and lack of basic infrastructure killed thousands every year. The Irish, fleeing the Great Famine, arrived hoping for better lives and found grinding poverty. Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe in the 1880s and 1890s settled in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, areas that would become infamous. This wasn't hidden. The wealthy knew about it. They just didn't care enough to fix it. The contrast between Mayfair's mansions and Whitechapel's slums was so extreme it almost defied belief, yet both existed within walking distance of each other. Before we continue with the final chapter of this story, if you've made it this far, drop a comment below telling me which Victorian landmark you'd most want to visit, the Royal Opera House, the Savoy, or maybe one of those notorious gentlemen's clubs. Let me know, but even in that darkness, something interesting happened. The mixing of cultures, the collision of desperate ambition and impossible odds created pockets of creativity and resilience. It created communities. It created stories. It created the raw material that writers like Charles Dickens would turn into literature that still matters today. And let's not forget another symbol of Victorian luxury, one that literally moved: the trains. Pullman Car Company brought American-style luxury to Britain in 1874, and by 1908, the Southern Belle running between London and Brighton was being called the most luxurious train in the world. Cream and umber livery, 2 lavish dining cars, a ladies' drawing room, a smoking lounge with an outdoor viewing platform. The major British rail companies competed fiercely, rolling out services for affluent transatlantic travellers. Dedicated boat trains met passenger ships at Liverpool or Southampton, with liveried staff ushering travellers into sumptuous Pullman cars bound for London. Exotic wood panelling, chandeliers, gourmet cuisine served on the finest china. It was luxury in motion, uniquely Victorian. So what happened to all of this? Why did the Golden Age end? The simple answer is World War I. The Great War shattered the Victorian world. The social order that had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, collapsed. The aristocracy lost its sons in the trenches and its relevance in the aftermath. The rigid class system began to crack. The empire that had funded all that luxury began its long, slow decline. But here's the thing, the end of an era doesn't mean it disappears completely. It leaves traces. And the traces left by Victorian London's Golden Age are everywhere, even now. The architecture is the most obvious. Walk through central London today, stand in front of the Royal Opera House or the old railway hotels like St. Pancras, or the grand buildings that still line the Strand. You're seeing that era directly. Those buildings were constructed with the conviction they'd last centuries, and they have. The hotels are another trace. The Savoy, Claridge's, Browns, they're all still operating, still luxurious, still hosting the wealthy and powerful. The standards of hospitality they established, the idea that service could be an art form, that's a Victorian legacy. The theatres too. The Royal Opera House still presents world-class opera and ballet. The West End Theatre District, which exploded during the Victorian era, is still one of the greatest concentrations of live performance on earth. And there's something less tangible but just as real, a way of being a city. London's identity, its sense of itself as a place of culture, commerce and contradictions, was forged in those decades between 1850 and 1900. If this journey through luxury and darkness in Victorian London fascinated you, make sure you're subscribed, because next week we're diving into Paris during the Belle Epoque, where things got even wilder. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. The Victorian Golden Age was a moment that couldn't last. It was built on empire, on exploitation, on inequalities so vast they eventually became unsustainable. The luxury of the Savoy existed because of colonial plantations worked by people who would never see a grand hotel. The silk gowns at the Opera House were stitched by underpaid East End seamstresses. The wealth that built Mayfair's mansions came from factories where children worked 12-hour days. We can't romanticize it without acknowledging that. But it was also a period of extraordinary energy, ambition, and creativity. It gave us architecture that still takes your breath away. The Royal Opera House, St Pancras Station, Leadenhall Market, Tower Bridge. These weren't just functional structures. They were declarations that this city intended to be remembered. It gave us standards of art and performance that still matter. The idea that culture belongs to a nation, that artistic excellence is worth pursuing for its own sake. Those are Victorian values we inherited. It gave us stories that still resonate. Charles Dickens, writing about poverty. Oscar Wilde, dissecting high society's hypocrisy. Robert Louis Stevenson and Arthur Conan Doyle, creating immortal characters. And most importantly, it reminds us that golden ages are always complicated. They're never as golden for everyone as the name suggests. For every aristocrat sipping champagne at Claridge's, there were thousands who'd never taste champagne. For every night at the Opera House, there were countless nights in freezing tenements, but they're also never entirely myth. Victorian London really was extraordinary. Between 1850 and 1870, it became the most urbanized nation in the West, the industrial capital of the world. Electric lights, elevators, running water, underground trains, telephones, all pioneered in Victorian London. The infrastructure built then still functions today. The first underground line opened in 1863. You can still ride it. The Savoy still operates. Claridge's still hosts royalty. The Royal Opera House still stages world-class performances. Many gentlemen's clubs still exist. And if you know where to look, you can still see that light today, reflected in the buildings, in the culture, in the way London thinks about itself. Victorian London's golden age ended, but it never really disappeared. It's there in every gas lamp converted to electric. It's there in every grand hotel maintaining standards set 150 years ago. It's there in every theatre where the curtain rises and for a few hours you can almost imagine you're back in that world where anything seemed possible and the night was just beginning.